The smug grin on my wife's lover's face was the last straw. He leaned in close, taunting me with words I can't forget. "You're just a little grease monkey. She's mine now." My fists clenched, my vision blurred, and before I knew it, the Christmas party had erupted into chaos. The next thing he knew, he woke up in a hospital bed, and my life was forever changed. What followed wasn't just a fight, it was the unraveling of betrayal, sacrifice, and justice. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. The courtroom buzzed with a tense undercurrent, a low hum of murmured conversations and the occasional rustle of papers. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated every corner, leaving no shadow to hide in. The wooden benches, polished but worn, creaked under the shifting weight of the audience. The faint aroma of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp scent of freshly printed legal documents. At the center of the room stood Hank Sack, a 45-year-old car mechanic, his steel blue eyes scanning the jury with a mix of apprehension and determination. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the defendant's table, revealing calluses earned from years of hard labor. Despite his rough exterior, there was a quiet dignity about him, a man who had worked tirelessly for his family and was now fighting for his future. Across the aisle, Zelda, or Zaja as she liked to be called, exuded an air of aloof confidence. Her meticulously styled jet-black hair, in pristine suit, painted her as someone far removed from her working-class beginnings. Beside her sat Cody, a muscular younger man who lounged with a smirk, exuding arrogance. His designer suit and smug demeanor were in stark contrast to Hank's modest attire. The sight of them together was a sharp reminder of the betrayal that had brought Hank here. In the audience, Hank's teenage daughters Michelle and Stephanie sat upright, their eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. Their presence seemed to anchor Hank, fueling his resolve. When the judge nodded for Hank to begin, he rose from his chair, adjusting the simple tie he wore. He cleared his throat, his voice slightly hoarse but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hank began, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My name is Hank Sack, but please, don't call me Henry. It makes me furious when people do." A few chuckles rippled through the room, breaking the tension. Hank allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. "I'm not a lawyer," he continued, pacing slightly. "I'm a car mechanic. My legal education? 25 years of watching Law and Order reruns, but what I lack in law degrees I make up for in honesty. I'm here today not because I'm a violent man, but because I walked into a Christmas party and found my wife with another man. And that man," Hank gestured toward Cody, his voice tightening, "had the audacity to call me Little Henry and brag about stealing the money I saved for my daughter's college tuition." The room grew quiet. The jury leaned in, their interest peaked. "Oh yes," Hank admitted, his voice firm, "I may have lost my temper. But tell me, is it really a crime to defend your family and your dignity? If so, then maybe I'm guilty, but I trust you to see the truth." His eyes darted toward Zelda and Cody, their smug expressions now tinged with unease. Hank turned back to the jury, his voice softening but never wavering. "I'm not here to beg for mercy. I'm here to fight for what's right, for myself, for my daughters, and for every husband and father who's been betrayed. Thank you." The courtroom fell silent, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, it felt as though justice itself was listening. The attendees scowled but kept their distance. It was the kind of night that could have been pulled straight from the pages of a Gothic novel. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the streets of Los Angeles into shimmering rivers under the glow of flickering streetlights. Thunder growled low in the distance, a warning rumble that seemed to echo in Hank's chest as he closed up his small garage for the day. The sign reading Hank's Auto Repair swayed in the stormy wind, its chain groaning like an old hinge. Just as he flipped the last switch, plunging the shop into shadow, a car screeched to a stop outside. The headlights, glaring and erratic, barely illuminated the figure stepping out into the rain. Hank frowned, his fingers hesitating on the door lock. A small part of him wanted to ignore the disturbance. He was tired, and the night was miserable. But something about the way the figure struggled against the wind pulled at his sense of duty. He tried to When she stepped into the dim light of the garage, he felt his breath hitch. She was beautiful, in a way that seemed almost out of place in the gritty world of auto repair shops and grease-streaked uniforms. Her jet-black hair clung to her face, slick from the rain, and her large, dark eyes carried a mix of desperation and determination. Her coat, oversized and drenched, barely contained her trembling form. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the drumming of rain on the metal roof. "My car won't start. I need to get to San Francisco tonight, for my father's funeral." Hank hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside, gesturing her in. "Let me take a look," he said, grabbing a flashlight. His voice was steady, but his mind whirled. There was something hauntingly fragile about her presence, something that made him feel both protective and cautious. As he worked under the hood, his hands deftly navigating wires and fuses, she stood nearby holding the flashlight. Her silence wasn't rude, it was heavy, like a weight she couldn't set down. He stole a glance at her now and then, noticing how her shoulders slumped under the burden of grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, breaking the quiet. She blinked, as if startled by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she murmured. After a pause, she added, "I didn't think anyone would still be open this late." Hank shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I wasn't, but I'm glad I was here. Can't let you miss something as important as that." Her gaze softened for the first time, and he felt a faint flicker of warmth despite the cold seeping through the open garage door. "You're kind," she said, almost to herself. The hours stretched on as Hank combed through the car's electrical system. The rain continued its relentless assault outside, but inside there was a growing sense of calm. By the time he discovered the culprit, a loose wire and a cracked clip, it was well past 8 p.m. With a few adjustments, the engine roared to life, filling the garage with its triumphant hum. Hank straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as he looked at her. She was leaning against the workbench now, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's ready," he said, simply. She nodded, but her expression crumpled as the weight of the night overtook her. The tears she had held back spilled over, and she covered her face with trembling hands. Without thinking, Hank stepped closer, his instincts urging him to offer comfort. "It's okay," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're going to make it. Just let it out." To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her sobs muffled against his chest. It felt strange yet natural, holding this stranger in the middle of his dimly lit garage. For the first time in months, since his own breakup had left him hollow, he felt a connection. When her sobs subsided, she stepped back, brushing at her face. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier this time. "For everything." Hank smiled faintly. "You're welcome. And if you're nervous about the drive, if you need someone to help you get there, I'd be happy to." Her eyes widened slightly, the offer catching her off guard. "You'd do that?" He shrugged, trying to play it casual. "Sure, if you've got a place for me to crash in San Francisco, I can get you there and back." "So?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll call my mom. She'll make space." As they left the garage, the rain seemed to ease, as if the storm had softened just for them. Yet Hank couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting, while fateful, carried the shadow of something far more complicated. But for now, he chose to ignore the nagging sense of foreboding. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, and the woman who, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, felt like she might change everything. In the year that followed their fateful meeting on that stormy night, Hank and Zelda's relationship blossomed with an intensity that could only be described as whirlwind. From the moment her car roared back to life and she melted into his arms, the two seemed inseparable. Their shared journey began with quiet conversations over late-night coffee and quickly evolved into deep discussions about dreams, fears, and futures. Despite their stark differences, there was a magnetic pull between them that neither could resist. Hank, ever the optimist, found himself energized by Zelda's ambitious spirit. She spoke of her dreams to graduate from UCLA and make something of herself, and Hank admired her determination. For his part, Hank's passion for fixing cars and finding beauty in the simple mechanics of life fascinated Zelda. While she teased him about his perpetually grease-stained hands, she also marveled at how he could coax life out of a dying machine. "Every car has a story," he once told her, his eyes lighting up as he wiped oil from his hands. "I guess I like to give them a second chance." Zelda had smiled then, the warmth in her expression contrasting with her usual guarded demeanor. "You're good at that, Hank," she said softly, "giving second chances." Their days together were filled with small, meaningful gestures that deepened their bond. Zelda would bring Hank sandwiches during his long hours at the garage, insisting he needed a proper meal. In return, Hank would surprise her with flowers picked from the roadside on his way to her apartment. Neither gesture was extravagant, but they were steeped in thoughtfulness. One unforgettable moment came during a rare rainstorm in Los Angeles. The city, unused to heavy showers, had come to a near standstill. Zelda, stranded on campus, called Hank for help. Without hesitation, he left work early and drove through the flooded streets to pick her up. By the time he arrived, Zelda was drenched but laughing as she stood under an awning. "You look like a drowned cat," Hank teased as he handed her his jacket. "And you look like my knight in shining armor," she replied, sliding into the passenger seat. As the rain battered the car roof, they found themselves laughing and singing along to an old country song on the radio. For Hank, it was the first time in years he'd felt truly alive. For Zelda, it was a moment of rare vulnerability, one she allowed herself to share. Still, Hank couldn't shake a quiet unease that occasionally surfaced. While Zelda's laughter was infectious and her presence intoxicating, there were moments when she seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. She rarely spoke of her family beyond surface details, and when Hank pressed her, she would change the subject. "There's just a lot to unpack," she'd say with a forced smile, brushing it off, "but it's nothing to worry about." Hank tried to ignore the feeling, choosing instead to focus on the present. Yet late at night, as he lay awake in bed, he couldn't help but wonder if their differences, his grounded simplicity versus her relentless drive for something more, might one day become a chasm. As their one-year anniversary approached, Hank decided to take a leap of faith. On a sunny afternoon, he took Zelda to Griffith Park, where they hiked to a scenic overlook. The city sprawled below them, shimmering in the golden light of sunset. Hank pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. The last thing he remembered was dropping his mom off at work. He'd always felt like he wasn't being efficient with his time. "Zelda," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I don't have much, but I promise to give you everything I can. Will you marry me?" For a moment Zelda said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, with tears in her eyes, she nodded. "Yes, Hank," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. "Yes, I'll marry you." The months that followed were filled with wedding preparations and dreams for the future. Zelda's determination and Hank's unwavering support made them a formidable team. Together, they planned a life that balanced her ambitions with his steady presence. Despite occasional doubts, Hank believed that their love could weather any storm. Zelda, for her part, seemed genuinely happy, throwing herself into their shared plans with enthusiasm. Their love story, born in a storm, now seemed poised to shine brightly in the years to come. And yet, in the quiet moments when neither spoke, the faintest hint of uncertainty lingered, a shadow that Hank was determined to ignore, trusting that their bond would overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. From the moment Hank first picked up a wrench, he knew he was born to work on cars. The rhythmic hum of engines, the slick feel of oil on his hands, and the challenge of bringing a broken machine back to life, it was his passion and his craft. Working long hours in garages across Los Angeles, Hank earned a reputation for being the mechanic who could fix anything. Whether it was a stubborn family sedan or a finicky high-performance Ferrari, he approached every job with the same meticulous care. Yet for Hank, fixing cars was more than just a job. It was his way of providing for his family, a responsibility he never took lightly. Early in his career, he promised himself that no matter how hard he had to work, his children would never know the struggles he endured growing up. It was this promise that fueled his determination to excel. He wasn't just repairing cars, he was building a future. Despite the demands of his work, Hank found joy in every small success. Each satisfied customer and each engine roaring back to life brought a sense of accomplishment. Over time, word spread about his skills, and soon he was sought after by not only loyal locals, but also wealthier clients who appreciated his honesty and expertise. His boss at the Ferrari shop once quipped, "Hank, you don't just fix cars, you resurrect them." But Hank's pride wasn't in the money he made or the status he gained. It was in the impact his hard work had on his family. Every paycheck, every overtime shift, and every side project served a singular purpose: securing a better life for his daughters Michelle and Stephanie. For years, he set aside as much as he could, funneling it into a college fund that slowly but steadily grew. He tracked every dollar in a worn notebook, calculating how much closer they were to his ultimate goal. The day he reached $887,000 was one he would never forget. Sitting at the kitchen table with his daughters, he showed them the numbers. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is for your dreams. Stanford, UCLA, wherever you want to go, it's all here." Michelle and Stephanie's faces lit up, their gratitude shining through their smiles. "Dad," Michelle said, her voice trembling, "you're amazing." Hank chuckled, brushing off the praise. "I just fixed some cars. You two will do the hard part, becoming something great." Even in his pride, Hank remained humble. He knew the sacrifices it had taken to build that fund: missed vacations, skipped luxuries, and countless late nights in the garage. Yet he never saw these as losses. Instead, they were investments in the future of his family, a legacy he could be proud of. As the years passed, Hank's career flourished, but he never let it consume him. He limited overtime, ensuring he was home for family dinners, school plays, and soccer games. The garage, for all its grease and grime, was his sanctuary, but his family was his world. His daughters often teased him about his ever-present oil-stained hands, and Zelda would laugh, saying, "You may not smell like roses, but you smell like security." Through it all, Hank's commitment to his family remained unwavering. While others might have seen him as just a mechanic, Hank saw himself as an architect of his children's future. And as he watched them grow, he knew every late night, every sacrifice, and every dollar saved was worth it. His hands may have been calloused and worn, but they were hands that built dreams. As he closed the shop each night, he would often glance at a photograph of his family tucked in his toolbox, a quiet reminder of why he worked so tirelessly. To Hank, every drop of sweat, every ache in his joints, and every sacrifice was a labor of love, proof that he was doing right by the people who mattered most. And with that, he would lock the garage, ready to do it all again tomorrow. In the early years of their marriage, Zelda, or Zaja as she liked to be called, was the heart of the household. While Hank poured his energy into the garage, Zelda ensured the home thrived with warmth and care. She would greet him at the door after a long day, their daughters clinging to her legs, and dinner bubbling on the stove. She was ambitious but grounded, balancing her work as a fledgling mortgage broker with her responsibilities as a wife and mother. Hank often admired her ability to handle it all with grace, calling her his North Star. Mira. However, as time passed, that balance began to shift. Zelda's career in real estate took off after she transitioned from mortgages to selling homes. Her charisma, intelligence, and relentless drive made her an exceptional agent. She quickly gained a reputation for closing difficult deals and earned accolades within her company. With each success, her ambition grew, and so did her workload. Promotions brought more money, but they also demanded more of her time and energy. At first, Hank was proud of Zelda's achievements, cheering her on at award ceremonies and helping her prepare for open houses. But the cracks in their family life became evident when she started missing dinners. "Just one late night," she would say. But soon, one night turned into several, then most. Hank began to notice the subtle changes: the laptop that never left the dining table, the phone calls that interrupted bedtime stories, the distracted nods during conversations. The real turning point came when Zelda landed her biggest client yet, a wealthy developer with an endless stream of properties. Her focus shifted entirely to this client, leaving little room for anything else. Family outings were replaced by weekend showings, and holidays were cut short for business calls. Even when she was home, she seemed miles away, lost in her work. One evening, as Hank served dinner to their daughters, Zelda walked in late, still dressed in a sharp blazer and heels. She glanced at the table, mumbled a quick apology, and disappeared into her office. Stephanie, the younger daughter, whispered, "Why doesn't Mom eat with us anymore?" Hank didn't have an answer. As her success grew, so did the distance between Zelda and her family. She began placing trophies and awards on the mantel, slowly displacing family photos. Hank tried to address the issue gently. "Zelda," he said one night, "I'm proud of you, but the girls miss their mom." Zelda sighed, barely looking up from her laptop. "I'm doing this for them, Hank. Don't you see? I'm building something bigger. For all of us." But the truth was undeniable. Zelda's priorities had shifted. Her family no longer came first. She justified her absence by emphasizing the financial security she was creating, but the emotional void she left behind told another story. Her daughters stopped waiting for her to join them at the dinner table, and Hank found himself alone in the kitchen most nights, washing dishes in silence. The rift deepened when Zelda began associating her self-worth solely with her career. She dismissed her family's concerns, labeling them as ungrateful. "Do you think this life pays for itself?" she snapped during an argument. "I'm out there making things happen while you all sit back and complain." Yet, for all her professional triumphs, Zelda seemed increasingly unhappy. The joy she once radiated at family gatherings was replaced by exhaustion and irritability. Hank couldn't help but feel that in chasing success, Zelda had lost sight of what truly mattered. Despite his best efforts to bridge the growing gap, it became clear that they were no longer partners navigating life together, but two people walking separate paths. And so, the dynamic of their marriage shifted. Zelda's trophies gleamed brighter, but the warmth of their home dimmed. Hank continued to hold the family together, but even his boundless patience was beginning to wear thin. As he sat in their quiet living room one night, staring at the empty spot Zelda should have filled, he realized that the woman he had once fallen in love with had become a stranger, more invested in her career than the family they had built together. The tension in the Sock household was not sudden but gradual, creeping in like a slow leak that eventually floods a room. At first, Zelda's long hours as a real estate agent were justified by her determination to support the family. "Just one more sale, Hank," she'd say with a tired smile. "It's all for us, for the girls." Hank believed her. They all did, but over time her focus shifted, not towards the family's needs, but towards her own ambitions. Zelda's absence became the norm. Dinners that were once filled with laughter and shared stories were now quieter. The empty seat at the table a constant reminder of her growing distance. The smell of takeout replaced home-cooked meals, and the girls, Michelle and Stephanie, grew used to hearing, "Sorry, I can't make it tonight," whenever they asked their mom to attend their school events. One evening, Michelle broke the silence as the family sat down for dinner, without Zelda yet again. "Does she even care anymore?" she asked, her fork clinking against her plate. Her voice was small but loaded with frustration. Hank looked at his daughter, his heart aching. "She's just busy, sweetheart," he replied, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Stephanie, younger but just as perceptive, crossed her arms. "Busy with what? Selling houses? She's always too busy for us." The breaking point came on a rainy Friday evening. Zelda burst through the door, her heels clicking on the floor, her arms full of papers and a shiny gold trophy. "Guess what?" she exclaimed, her voice triumphant. "I'm the top agent at the company." She placed the trophy on the mantel, brushing aside a family photo to make room. The photograph, a candid shot of Hank, Zelda, and the girls from years ago, was knocked to the side, hanging precariously on the edge. Nobody said anything at first. Hank quietly reached over to adjust the picture, placing it back in its rightful spot, though the trophy now loomed over it like an uninvited guest. Michelle's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "You care more about that stupid trophy than us," she blurted, her voice trembling with anger. "Michelle, that's not fair," Zelda began, clearly taken aback. "No, Mom, it's not fair," Michelle shouted. "It's not fair that you're never here. It's not fair that we don't matter to you anymore." Stephanie chimed in, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't even ask how we're doing, you just care about work." Zelda stood frozen, clutching her papers like a shield. "I'm doing this for you," she said defensively. "Everything I do is for this family." But Michelle's glare was unrelenting. "If that's true, then why don't we feel like it?" The silence that followed was deafening. Zelda turned to Hank, seeking his support, but he simply shook his head. "You're losing them, Zial," he said softly, "and maybe you're losing me too." Later that night, as Zelda retreated to her office, the girls sat with Hank on the couch. Michelle leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't care about us. Hank wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. I'll always be here for you. Both of you. The mantle, with its new arrangement, became a symbol of the growing divide. The trophy, shiny and cold, stood as a stark contrast to the warmth and unity the family photo once represented. It was clear to everyone, except Zelda, that her pursuit of success had come at a cost far greater than she realized. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Zelda and her family widened. Every time the girls passed the mantle, they would glance at the trophy, a bitter reminder of where her priorities lay. For Hank, it wasn't just about the physical object. It was about what it represented. A family slowly falling apart under the weight of misplaced ambitions. The moment Hank stepped into the brightly lit office building, he knew something was off. The cheerful hum of holiday music couldn't mask the cold knot forming in his stomach. Strings of twinkling lights adorned the walls, and employees mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. Yet, despite the festive ambiance, Hank felt like an unwelcome ghost in a world he didn't belong to. He had only come to surprise Zelda. She hadn't mentioned the party to him, but a client at the garage had casually remarked about the event earlier that day. Curious, and perhaps a bit hopeful, Hank decided to stop by, thinking it might be a chance to reconnect with his wife. He clutched the small gift box he had brought for her, a delicate bracelet she had once admired in a shop window. Ever since her funeral, Hank had been fused with a sense of joy that had swiftly metabolized into strength. She had said in the past. As he made his way through the crowded room, Hank's eyes scanned for Zelda. He spotted her across the room, her laughter ringing out over the hum of conversation. His heart clenched as he saw her leaning into Cody, a younger man Hank recognized from her stories about work. Cody's hand rested possessively on Zelda's lower back, his fingers lingering in a way that sent a surge of anger through Hank. For a moment, Hank froze. His mind raced with conflicting emotions. Confusion, betrayal, and a simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He wanted to believe he was mistaken, that there was some innocent explanation. But as he watched Zelda laugh at something Cody whispered in her ear, leaning closer than necessary, the truth became undeniable. The box in his hand felt heavy, a cruel reminder of his misplaced trust. His breath quickened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and leave, to escape the humiliation of the scene unfolding before him. But he couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the spot, his chest tightening with every second he stood there. Finally, Zelda noticed him. Her smile faltered, replaced by a fleeting look of panic before she quickly masked it with indifference. Cody, noticing her change in demeanor, followed her gaze in locked eyes with Hank. A smirk spread across his face. Arrogant, taunting. Well, Cody drawled, stepping away from Zelda and sauntering toward Hank. If it isn't little Henry. The condescension in his voice was like gasoline on a fire. What are you doing here? Did your wife forget to invite you? Hank's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his mind a whirlwind of fury and disbelief. Cody leaned closer, lowering his voice but ensuring Zelda could still hear. I'm the man in her life now, he sneered. You're just a useless old grease monkey. The words hit Hank like a punch to the gut. Years of sacrifices, of hard work to provide for his family, of enduring the growing distance in his marriage. All of it mocked in a single sentence. His vision blurred, red creeping in at the edges as rage overtook him. Without thinking, Hank dropped the gift box and lunged forward, grabbing Cody by the collar. Say that again, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation. Cody smirked, even as Hank's grip tightened. You heard me, Henry. You're nothing. The first punch landed squarely on Cody's jaw, wiping the smirk from his face. Gasps echoed through the room as the younger man stumbled backward, crashing into a nearby table. Zelda screamed, but Hank barely registered it. Years of pent-up frustration and betrayal exploded in a fury of punches, each one a release of the pain he had carried for so long. It wasn't until security pulled him away that Hank realized what he had done. Cody lay on the floor, blood dripping from his nose, and a look of stunned disbelief replacing his arrogance. Hank's chest heaved, his knuckles raw and trembling. Zelda stood frozen, her expression a mix of anger and guilt. As he was escorted out of the building, Hank caught one last look at her. Any hope of reconciliation was gone, replaced by a cold certainty. The woman he had loved for 20 years was no longer the Zelda he knew. And as the cold night air hit his face, he realized that he wasn't just walking away from the party. He was walking away from the life he had fought so hard to build. The room was alive with holiday cheer, laughter spilling over the edges of conversations, but for Hank, the Christmas party felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Cody's smirk still lingered in his mind, a taunting echo of the arrogance the younger man had exuded. Hank stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, the weight of years of betrayal and frustration pressing heavily on his chest. The small, carefully wrapped gift box he'd brought for Zelda now lay crumpled on the floor where he had dropped it, a symbol of his shattered hopes. Zelda moved toward him, her face tight with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "What are you doing here, Hank?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through his thoughts. "And I could ask you the same thing," Hank replied, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Celebrating Christmas without your family, or is this your new family?" His gaze flicked to Cody, who leaned casually against the bar, sipping champagne as if he hadn't a care in the world. Cody set his glass down and sauntered toward Hank, his every movement deliberate, dripping with condescension. The crowd parted slightly, sensing the tension brewing between the two men. "Relax, Henry," Cody said, with a smug grin, emphasizing the name he knew Hank despised. "No need to make a scene. We all know you're not cut out for this kind of environment." Hank's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as his hands curled into fists. "Don't call me that," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Cody? Hans?" Cody leaned in closer, his grin widening. "You're just mad because she upgraded. Let's face it, old man, you were never good enough for her." She cocked her head and peered at him. "What? I never caused anyone hurt," Hans said. It was as if a dam broke inside Hank. Without thinking, he swung his fist, the impact sending Cody stumbling backward into the bar. Glasses shattered, the sound punctuating the stunned gasps of the onlookers. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, the festive music still playing incongruously in the background. But it wasn't over. Cody pushed himself off the bar, his smirk now replaced with a snarl. "You're going to regret that," he spat, lunging at Hank. The two men collided, a flurry of punches and grappling as the crowd scrambled to get out of the way. "Hank, stop!" Zelda screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos, but he barely registered it. Years of pent-up frustration, her indifference, and now her betrayal, exploded in every punch he threw. Cody managed to land a few hits, but Hank's raw anger drove him forward, each blow more forceful than the last. Tables overturned, decorations fell, and the carefully curated elegance of the party descended into chaos. Finally, security intervened, pulling the two men apart. Hank's breathing was ragged, his knuckles bruised and bloodied, but he barely felt the pain. Cody, on the other hand, looked worse for wear. A split lip, a swollen eye, and the arrogant veneer he had worn so confidently, now shattered. "Get him out of here," one of the security guards barked, dragging Hank toward the exit. As he was hauled away, he caught one last look at Zelda. She stood, frozen in the middle of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and anger. "Is this what you wanted?" Hank shouted, his voice echoing through the now silent room. "To humiliate me? To destroy everything we built together?" Zelda didn't answer. She didn't even move. And that, more than anything, was the final blow. Inside, the cold air hit Hank like a slap, his breath forming clouds in the icy night. His hands trembled, not from the fight, but from the storm of emotions raging within him. He knew the consequences of his actions would be severe. Assault charges were almost certain, and the last remnants of his marriage were now irreparably broken. But even as he sat on the curb, head in his hands, Hank felt something else. A strange, bitter clarity. The fight hadn't been just about Cody or even Zelda. It was about the years of sacrifices, the love he had poured into his family, and the realization that it had all been taken for granted. As the police sirens approached in the distance, Hank exhaled deeply, bracing himself for what was to come. The altercation had left scars, both visible and invisible, but it had also marked the beginning of an uncharted path, one that Hank would have to navigate on his own terms. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Hank rose from his seat. His defense was unconventional, but he had no choice but to make every word, every witness count. He had watched courtroom dramas for years, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that surprises could tilt the scales in a trial. The first witness was Hank's elder daughter, Michelle. She walked to the stand with a calm determination, her head held high. Dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, she looked every bit the intelligent, composed young woman she had become. "Michelle, can you tell the court about the impact your mother's actions have had on your life?" Hank asked, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Michelle nodded, her voice trembling as she began. "I'm a senior in high school and I was accepted into Stanford early, but now I can't go because the college fund my dad spent years saving is gone." Her words hung in the air, the gravity of her statement clear. The jurors leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. Hank saw one woman in the jury dab her eyes with a tissue. "Who saved that money, Michelle?" Hank asked. "My dad," she said firmly, her voice rising with conviction. "He worked late nights, skipped vacations, and sacrificed everything for me and my sister. And now it's gone, spent on a Porsche for someone else." At that moment, Michelle broke down, tears streaming down her face as she ran to embrace Hank. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sobs of the teenaged girl. The jury's sympathetic gazes followed her back to her seat, and Hank saw the impact her testimony had made. Stephanie, the younger of Hank's daughters, was next. Though visibly nervous, her anger and frustration were clear as she sat down. "Stephanie," Hank began, "can you describe how your mother's actions affected your family?" Stephanie took a deep breath. "She wasn't there. Not for family dinners, not for our games. And now, she's taken everything from us. Our future, our trust." She paused, her voice cracking. "She chose him over us." The prosecution objected, but the damage was done. As Stephanie pointed directly at her mother, the raw betrayal in her voice was undeniable. "I begged my dad not to divorce her, thinking maybe she'd come back to us. But I was wrong." Her final words hung in the room like a thunderclap. One juror shook his head, while another avoided looking in Zelda's direction. Stephanie's testimony reinforced the emotional weight of the case, and Hank knew the foundation of his defense was secure. After a brief recess, the court reconvened, and Hank called Mrs. Caldwell, Zelda's office manager. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the middle-aged woman, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took the stand. Since training, Hank's expression was equilibrium, but prior to the court-martial, he sometimes looked hunched over, searching for the right words to explain. "Mrs. Caldwell, how long have you worked with my wife?" Hank asked. 5 years, she replied. "And in that time, did you observe anything inappropriate?" Hank's tone was deliberate, leading her to the pivotal moment. "Oh, plenty," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice cold. Zelda made no secret of her affair with Cody. She bragged about it constantly, saying you'd never figure it out because, and I quote, "he's just a grease monkey." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Zelda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confident facade beginning to crack. "And did this affair affect her work performance?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "She was distracted, missed deadlines, and used company resources to fund her outings with Cody." The jury exchanged incredulous glances. Mrs. Caldwell's testimony not only painted Zelda in a damning light, but also shattered any remnants of her credibility. Finally, it was Cody's turn to take the stand. His towering figure and smug demeanor filled the courtroom, but Hank was ready. "Cody," Hank began, "you claim I attacked you without provocation. Is that correct?" "That's right," Cody said confidently. "I didn't do anything wrong." Hank nodded, pacing slowly. "And yet, you bragged about my wife draining our college fund to buy you a Porsche, did you not?" Cody hesitated, the smirk faltering for the first time. I might have said something, but it was just a joke." "A joke?" Hank's voice sharpened. Is that why you called me Little Henry at the party? Another joke? The jury's eyes bore into Cody, his arrogance now working against him. Hank pressed on. How much money did my wife give you, Cody? Was it worth breaking up a family? Cody stammered, his earlier confidence unraveling. I don't know the exact amount. Hank turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence of canceled checks made out to Cody, totaling over $125,000. The room erupted in whispers as Hank presented the evidence. Cody's face turned crimson, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Tell me, Cody, Hank said, his voice calm but cutting. What exactly do you bring to the table that's worth $125,000? Laughter erupted from the jury, a rare moment of levity in an otherwise tense trial. The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. Cody's credibility was in tatters, and Hank had successfully shifted the narrative. By the end of the testimonies, the jury's faces told the story. Sympathy for Hank had grown steadily, and any doubt about his character had been replaced with disdain for Zelda and Cody. As Hank rested his case, he could see the tide turning. The weight of the truth, coupled with the raw emotion of his daughters and the damning facts revealed by the office manager, had made an undeniable impact. As the courtroom adjourned for the day, Hank felt a cautious sense of hope. Justice, it seemed, might finally be within reach. The courtroom was thick with tension as Hank took a deep breath and stepped to the center of the room. The eyes of the jury were fixed on him, a mix of curiosity and skepticism flickering in their gazes. Hank knew this was his one chance to convince them not just of his innocence, but of his humanity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hank began, adjusting his tie with a slightly sheepish smile. I want to start by thanking you for being here. I know you'd all rather be anywhere else, especially somewhere with less fluorescent lighting and fewer people arguing, but I appreciate you sticking it out. A few chuckles rippled through the room, breaking the icy tension. Hank allowed himself a small smile. Humor had always been his way of bridging gaps, and today was no different. Now, I'm not a lawyer, he continued, pacing slowly. I'm just a car mechanic. My experience with the law pretty much begins and ends with 25 years of Law and Order reruns. But if there's one thing I've learned, besides the fact that DA Jack McCoy can argue his way out of anything, it's that the truth matters. His voice softened as he turned to face the jury directly. And the truth is, I'm here today because I fought for my family. Not perfectly, not the way I wish I had, but I fought. Hank paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. You see, for the past 20 years, I've sacrificed everything for my wife and daughters. Late nights at the garage, weekends fixing temperamental Ferraris, holidays covered in grease instead of turkey gravy, all because I wanted to give them a better life. My daughters, he gestured toward Michelle and Stephanie, sitting in the audience, are my world. Every dollar I saved, every hour I worked, was for them. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. And I was proud of it. Proud to be the guy who could give his girls a future. But then I found out that the money I'd worked so hard to save wasn't going to their college fund anymore. It was going to buy a Porsche for a man who called me Little Henry. The room stirred at the mention of Cody, and Hank took the opportunity to inject a lighter note. Now, I'll admit, I'm not exactly tall, but you'd think the guy could come up with something more original. I mean, Little Henry? Really? That's the best he could do? The jury laughed, and Hank felt the weight in the room shift slightly. It was a small victory, but he seized it. I didn't confront Cody because I wanted to start a fight, Hank continued, his tone turning serious. I did it because I walked into that Christmas party and saw the life I'd built being torn apart. I saw a man who had everything handed to him, youth, arrogance, and my wife, mocking me for the sacrifices I made. And yeah, I lost my temper. I'm not proud of it, but I won't stand here and pretend I wouldn't do it again if it meant protecting my daughter's future. He turned to the jury, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. I didn't just defend my marriage. I defended all marriages, including yours. Because if we let people like Cody get away with seducing our spouses, stealing our money, and tearing apart our families, then what's left? What's sacred? A murmur ran through the room. Hank let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing, his tone softer now. I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. Plenty of them. But my daughters can tell you that I've always tried to do right by them, and if this trial is about whether I'm a good father, then I'll let them be the judge of that. Stephanie, unable to contain herself, stood up in the audience. You are the best father in the world, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the jury couldn't help but smile at the heartfelt outburst. Hank turned back to the jury, his own eyes misty. I may have lost my wife, but I'll be damned if I lose my daughters too. As he stepped back to his seat, the room was silent, save for the sound of scribbling as jurors took notes. Hank had laid his heart bare, blending humor with raw emotion, and the weight of his words lingered in the air like a promise. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Hank stood to question his surprise witness, Eddie Cochran. The assistant district attorney, ADA, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the confidence that had carried him through the trial beginning to falter. Hank had carefully orchestrated this moment, knowing it could tilt the scales in his favor. Eddie, a wiry man with a cautious demeanor, raised his right hand to be sworn in. As he took the stand, Hank approached, his voice steady but charged with intent. Mr. Cochran, have you ever met the assistant district attorney before today? Yes, Eddie replied, his gaze darting to the ADA. 3 years ago. The ADA immediately objected. Irrelevant. Read Smith's note. Hank countered, Your Honor, this testimony speaks to the ADA's credibility and moral authority in this case. The judge, intrigued, overruled the objection. Proceed. Hank turned back to Eddie. What happened during your previous encounter? Eddie hesitated but then recounted his story. I was in a relationship with the ADA's wife. One night, he came to my home with 2 police officers. They assaulted me, right in front of them. He said, this is what homewreckers deserve. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hank pressed on, his voice calm but resolute. Did you report this incident? Haysbert stayed quiet. No, Eddie admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. He threatened me with trumped-up charges if I did. The ADA leapt to his feet, his face red with anger. Objection! This is slander! The judge raised her hand, silencing him. Sustained, but the jury will disregard the ADA's interruption. Hank nodded, his tone sharpening as he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor standing before you today claims that vigilantism has no place in a civilized society. Yet he himself has used violence and intimidation to settle personal scores. Is this the moral high ground we're supposed to accept? Panther. The ADA's face paled as murmurs filled the room. Hank's words had struck a chord. Later that afternoon, the ADA's ex-wife was called to the stand. Though initially reluctant, she provided detailed accounts of her former husband's abusive behavior, supported by medical records. The evidence was undeniable, and the judge, visibly angered, called for a recess. When court resumed, the district attorney himself entered the room, flanked by deputies and media cameras. With a grave expression, he announced, "The ADA in this case has been suspended pending an internal investigation. My office does not condone abuse of power." The charges against Hank were promptly dropped, and the ADA was led out in handcuffs, his career in ruins. For the first time in weeks, Hank felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The spotlight shifted to Zelda, as Hank's victory over the ADA gave momentum to the case against her. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor listed the charges: fraud, theft, and forgery. Zelda sat rigid in her chair, her once confident demeanor now replaced with a pale, drawn expression. As evidence was presented, it became clear that Zelda had drained the family's college fund, mortgaged their home without Hank's consent, and funneled the money into lavish gifts for Cody, including a luxury car. The trail of forged documents bore her unmistakable signature. The prosecutor's voice was steady but cutting. "Mrs. Sack, you didn't just betray your husband. You stole your daughter's futures. Do you deny this?" Zelda remained silent, her hands trembling. When asked about her motivations, she finally spoke, her voice cracking. "I was unhappy. I wanted more. I thought I deserved more." The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Hank's daughters, seated in the audience, exchanged looks of anger and heartbreak. Stephanie whispered, "How could she do this to us?" The jury fell silent. When the judge delivered the verdict, her tone was resolute. "Mrs. Sack, your actions were not just selfish but destructive. You violated the trust of your family and abused the law for personal gain. For these crimes, you are sentenced to 5 years in prison." Zelda's face crumpled as the bailiff moved to cuff her. She turned to Hank, her eyes pleading. "Please, don't let them take me. Hank, I made mistakes, but I don't deserve this." Hank's expression was stone. "You made your choices, Zelda. Now you have to live with them." As Zelda was led away, her daughters stood, their faces hard with resolve. Michelle spoke softly but firmly. "We'll be okay, Dad. We've got you." Zelda turned, her hand on Zelda's arm, and they joined hands in ritual prayer together. For Hank, the moment was bittersweet. He had fought for justice and prevailed, but it had come at a steep cost. Still, as he walked out of the courtroom with his daughters by his side, he felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Zelda's betrayal had shattered their family, but the truth had finally set them free. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind for Hank. With his name cleared and his story garnering public sympathy, an unexpected opportunity came knocking. The district attorney himself invited Hank for a meeting, praising his tenacity and resourcefulness during the trial. "Hank," the DA said, leaning across his desk, "you've got a knack for uncovering the truth. That's a skill we could use. How would you feel about becoming an investigator for my office?" The offer took Hank by surprise, but it also reignited a fire he hadn't felt in years. After years of working on machines, the chance to fight for justice felt like a second lease on life. The DA outlined a path for him: enroll in a 6-month course on criminal law and investigation, shadow a seasoned investigator, and start earning a salary during training. The process wasn't easy. Hank spent long nights poring over textbooks, wrestling with legal jargon that felt like a foreign language. But he applied the same determination that had carried him through years as a mechanic. By the time he completed the course, he was ready, not just to tackle a new career, but to rebuild his life. Hank's first day on the job felt surreal. Instead of grease-stained overalls, he wore a suit and carried a badge. As he stepped into the DA's office, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just a new beginning, it was redemption. Months later, Hank found himself on a familiar highway, driving his daughters to their respective colleges. The truck was loaded with boxes, but this time the weight in his chest was lighter. The tension that had once clouded their family had given way to quiet understanding. As the truck hummed along, Michelle spoke up from the passenger seat. "Dad, I was thinking about everything you've done for us. The sacrifices, the late nights. We don't say it enough, but thank you." Hank glanced at her, his throat tightening. "You don't have to thank me, kiddo. It's what dads do." Stephanie leaned forward from the back seat, her voice softer. "Not all dads would. You've been our rock, even when everything else was falling apart." The words hung in the air, filling the truck with warmth. When they reached Michelle's college, Hank helped unload her boxes, each movement punctuated by laughter and shared memories. As they stood in her dorm room, Michelle hugged him tightly. "I'll miss you, Dad," she whispered. "I'll miss you too," Hank replied, his voice cracking. "But you're going to do great things. I know it." The drive to Stephanie's college was quieter, but no less emotional. When they arrived, Stephanie clung to him a little longer than usual. "Promise you'll visit," she said, her eyes glistening. "Every chance I get," Hank assured her. As he drove away, leaving both daughters to their new lives, Hank felt a mix of pride and melancholy. The truck was quieter, but his heart was full. He had fulfilled his promises, and their bond was stronger than ever. Life had a way of surprising Hank. Just when he thought his days of romance were behind him, he met Selma. Their first encounter was at an anger management seminar, a requirement for Hank after the trial. And for Selma, after her own fiery confrontation with her ex-husband's girlfriend. Selma was a force of nature, her fiery red hair and sharp wit making her impossible to ignore. "So, what's your story?" she asked Hank during a coffee break, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Hank hesitated but then smiled. "Let's just say I'm here because of a bad Christmas party." Selma laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "Well, I'm here because of a bad boyfriend. Looks like we're both rebuilding." As weeks turned into months, their conversations deepened. Selma shared stories of her own struggles and triumphs, and Hank found himself drawn to her resilience. She had a way of challenging him, of reminding him that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about living. Often, Hank would find himself looking up at the cloud-covered sky and wondering how he could explain the miracle that was his life. One evening, after a long day at work, Hank found himself at a small cafe with Selma. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "You know, Hank," she said softly, "it's never too late to start again." Looking into her eyes, Hank felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. It wasn't just about finding love again. It was about finding someone who understood his scars and saw the strength behind them. As they walked out of the cafe together, the city lights shimmering around them, Hank realized that his new beginning wasn't just about his career or his daughters. It was about opening his heart to possibilities he never thought he'd have again. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready.